This is the Kofford Books AuthorCast. Future Mormon by Adam S. Miller presents a hypothetical future generation of Latter-day Saints and their relationship with Mormonism. If current religiosity trends continue, then future generations will face unique challenges in staying connected with their faith tradition in an increasingly non-affiliated society. Future Mormon is, in a sense, a time capsule, a collection of thoughts and ideas that Adam styles para-academic, in the sense that he uses academic tools, but filters them through a pastoral and exegetical lens. He terms his approach future tense apologetics, and although his volume defends Mormon thought, it is far from defensive. Future Mormon is grounded in the idea that every generation has to find its own connection with faith, and that every generation must rethink the faith tradition from the ground up. In these essays, Adam explores theological and philosophical possibilities. He writes extensively on grace and its role in creation, the fall, and the atonement. He explores the concept of perfectibility in premortal and postmortal worlds. He challenges Platonism in Christianity and wrestles with the radical materialism of Mormonism. This is only a sample of the ideas that Future Mormon works through. In this episode, Adam will read his chapter, A Manifesto for the Future of Mormon Thinking, from Future Mormon.
A Manifesto for the Future of Mormon Thinking. This is a manifesto for the future of Mormon thinking. It is not a description, it is not a prediction, it is rather an invitation. In the future, Mormon thinking will be fearless. It will be fearless in the truth, and the only way to hold a truth fearlessly is, as John says, to hold it with perfect love. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. Only love is fearless, and only the fearless see the truth. If we fail to love, fear will cloud our eyes and skew our judgment. In order for thinking itself to be fearless, that thinking must be conducted as an act of love. And in order to be conducted as an act of love, we must do as Jesus says, we must love our enemies. Quote, Ye have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he makes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if ye love them which love you, what reward have ye? Do not even the publicans the same? End quote. Even sinners love those who love them. Even sinners love those who repeat what they want to hear and confirm what they already know. But such love is thoughtless. Those who love the truth and are fearless in it will be marked by their confidence that every truth can be thought again, indeed must be thought again, from the position of the enemy. Their confidence in this extension of the truth will be rooted in God's promise that the truth must rise on the evil and on the good. It must rain down on both the just and the unjust. All truths, in order to be truths, must be thinkable from the position of the enemy. All truths must be thinkable as an act of love for the enemy. It is, of course, possible to hold truths in a way that fails to be truthful. It's always possible to bear truth untruthfully, to wield the truth as a weapon against my enemy or as a shield to justify my stupor. And it is, of course, always possible to assume that every truth held by my enemy must be held in just this way, in bad faith, blinkered, untruthfully. But this is a scam. It's a diversion. The very work of seeing truth as truth, of bearing that truth truthfully, depends on our willingness to take up the perpetually necessary project of thinking through the truth again, always once more, from the position of the enemy. Every truth must be thought through again, because truths are bigger than we can manage. They cannot be confined to our own limited perspective. Though truths may fill us and transfigure us, they always do so only from somewhere else and on the way to somewhere new. A truth that is small enough to be thinkable only from my position and only in opposition to my enemy is no truth at all. To say that a truth must be thinkable from the position of the enemy is not to say that truths are relative to one's perspective. Rather, it is to insist that they are not. It is to say that truths must be capable of traversing and transfiguring every perspective that greets them. Truths, born truthfully, compel us to acknowledge both their capacity to transfigure every position and the reality that they are, as yet, only partial in their extension. What truths we have only in part. Much more is promised, and those truths already entrusted to us have barely begun to fill our own hearts and minds, let alone the world. To think a truth again, this time from the enemy's position, is to engage in the hard work of discovering what happens when we no longer treat the truth as proprietary, as owned by us, proper to us, and relative to our own perspective, and instead pursue its extension beyond our borders to see what happens when the truth also transfigures the position occupied by the enemy. To think a truth again is to investigate both how it can transform the enemy's position and what it looks like once I've let it loose in the world. Granted, my enemy's perspective is too small and too narrow to hold the truth, but occupied by a truth, that position can be transfigured. This is the promise of truth, transfiguration. Though on this score the same thing may be just as truthfully said of my own position. Love's extension of the truth is imperative, because I must also grant that my own perspective is too small and too narrow to hold the truth. Whatever tenuous relation I have to the truth can only be preserved if that truth is shared. In summary, then, the point is straightforward. Thinking that is not fearless is thoughtless, and thinking can only be fearless when it is conducted as an act of love, and thinking can only be conducted as an act of love when it traverses the position occupied by the enemy, transfiguring in the process myself, the truth, and the enemy. In what follows, I want to explore two examples of fearless thinking conducted as an act of love for the enemy. First, a thinking that transfigures the secular, and second, a thinking that transfigures subjectivity. Say we grant the claim that secularism is today the enemy of Mormonism. What follows? What follows is that secularism ought to be first in line for Mormon love and Mormon thinking. Secularism ought to be greeted fearlessly. No one should be thinking harder or better about secularism than Mormonism, and no one should be doing more to rethink truths from the secular position than Mormonism. Now again, a fearless extension of the truth to the secular position doesn't amount to either an adoption or a rejection of that position. Rather, the work of thinking must transfigure that position. It must proceed as an occupation that simultaneously transfigures all three elements involved: the enemy, Mormonism, and the truth. If our fearless thinking doesn't transfigure all three, then, whatever else was managed, truth will fail. More, let me emphasize that love's extension of the truth, its refusal to treat the truth as narrow and proprietary, is not a gesture of appeasement. It is, in fact, a form of resistance. It is a form of resistance that refuses to allow the enemy to be the enemy, that refuses to allow the enemy to be positioned as what must be excluded or opposed. Animated by love, real thinking is a form of fearless resistance that begins by offering again and again that most counterintuitive but most Christian of all gestures. It turns the other cheek. Rather than facing down the enemy, real thinking turns its head to see what the enemy was seeing. This gesture of love embodies the deepest possible act of resistance. It contests the enemy's right to be an enemy rather than a friend. Secularism needs to be contested. But if it is contested in the wrong way, if it is met with aggression or capitulation, then our resistance risks only reinforcing the oppositions upon which secularism itself depends. For the sake of truth, we must contest the founding oppositions that define secularism as such. Secularism defines itself in opposition to the not secular. That is, it defines itself in opposition to religion. To agree to this opposition, to agree that secularism and religion are enemies, is to have agreed in advance that secularism shall be allowed to frame the debate. Once this right is granted and its attendant opposition codified, truth has already been compromised. Ceding this position allows secularism to define, for both the secular person and the religious person, what religion is, and it allows secularism to define itself in opposition. Religion never understood itself as the not secular, until secularism defined it that way. And if religion wants to be serious about contesting secularism, it shouldn't start by granting that point. It shouldn't start by ratifying secularism's right to be the enemy. And it definitely shouldn't start, as many seem to do, by taking a secular premise that religion is essentially the not secular as the key to understanding religion itself. Transfiguring the secular will require that we steadfastly refuse to grant the premise that religion and secularism are enemies. You've doubtless seen on 1,000 fronts how this same sad fight plays out over and over between the secular and the religious under their liberal and conservative aliases. The liberal and conservative pair is a secular pair. To accept their opposition as a frame for combatively appropriating rather than compassionately extending truths is, again, to have undercut truth right from the start. It doesn't matter here that the conservative position is opposed to the secular position, because the opposition is itself secular. In fact, it's this very opposition that defines the legitimacy of secularism. The resulting irony is pretty thick. Loyal conservative opposition to liberal positions may goose some local tactical wins, but the astonishingly fierce loyalty of conservatives to the rules of this secular game guarantees, in the end, their strategic defeat.
Coming in July from Greg Kofford Books, Boadicea, The Mormon Wife, Life Scenes in Utah, the second volume in the Mormon Image and Literature series, edited and annotated by Michael Austin and Artis E. Parshall. First published in 1855, Boadicea gives us a glimpse of the Mormon image and literature immediately after the Church's public acknowledgement of plural marriage. Originally written by Alfreda Even Bell, a prolific author who worked at breakneck speed to imagine the lives of a strange people, filled with stories of polygamy and polyandry, along with a generous helping of adultery, seduction, kidnapping, and no fewer than 14 untimely but spectacular deaths. Boadicea will be available July 12th. Visit gregkofford.com for more details.
Fearless Mormon thinking will refuse to play this game. It will refuse to carve up the world into the secular versus the religious, or the liberal versus the conservative, and it will instead roam the whole world searching for truths, extending truths, transfiguring truths, and thinking through every manifestation of truth, always once more, always again, wherever those truths happen to show themselves. Fearless Mormon thinking will undermine wholesale the validity of the distinctions upon which the secular project depends, and it will construct a new space for thinking that won't allow the secular to operate as religion's governing opposition. Then, having decommissioned secularism as a governing term in religious self-understanding, it will evaluate, absorb, and repurpose the best elements of secularism itself. And finally, in the process of transfiguring the secular, Mormonism will itself be transfigured by its love for the enemy. Second example. Say we grant that Mormonism is profoundly threatened by the claim that our religion is just in our heads. Say we grant that Mormonism is threatened by the claim that, at best, Mormonism is a subjective pastiche of wishful thinking, soggy reasoning, willful self-deception, do-it-yourself cliches, middle management kitsch, and rose-tinted history that as a whole not only lacks objective reality but actively suppresses it. What follows? What follows is that fearless Mormon thinking ought to occupy this position. It ought to adopt this critique as God's own truth and find out how much water it can actually hold. This enemy is too big a threat for fearless Mormon thinking to do anything other than love it with a whole heart. If hiding in the clouds used to be an option, it isn't anymore. Fearless Mormon thinking needs to investigate in a massively sensitive and systematic investigation of religious subjectivity. It needs to investigate Mormon headspace and see what that head is made of, what thoughts compose it, what affects drive it, what languages articulate it, what neuroses compromise it, what stories organize it. If you take seriously the possibility that Mormonism boils down to fuzzy feelings and wishful thinking, what will you find? You will discover, first and foremost, something surprising about the nature of the mind, something that you might not have seen at all if you hadn't dared to love this enemy. If you take as a starting point the claim that Mormonism is just in people's heads, and then actually investigate, rather than dismiss, what's in those heads, you will find overwhelmingly that those heads are full of body. You will find that the head is stuffed full, not just with thoughts, but with light and color and smells and sounds and tastes and sensations. And then if you investigate what's in that body, you will find that the body is itself full of the world. You will find that the world is constantly flooding both the body and the head with ideas and sensations that rush in with sufficient force and oppose themselves with sufficient insistence that everything in the head is always, though in complicated ways, woven into the fabric of the world. You will find that mind and world aren't autonomous, and that despite their differences they have always already bled into each other in 1,000 tangled and inseparable ways. You will find that mind and world are composed of common ground. In short, you will find that there is no such thing as just the head. That position, once occupied, is transfigured. This is a basic phenomenological point. It shouldn't come as a surprise. Though, too, it shouldn't come as a surprise that in itself this point is no defense against the claim that Mormonism may, like Scientology, have woven itself into the fabric of the world in harmful, misleading, and unjustifiable ways. But still, granting this point is important, because at the very least it shows how a willingness to love this enemy has already reframed the basic question at hand. The real issue isn't whether the contents of Mormon heads are woven irrevocably into the fabric of the world itself. They are. The real question has to do with the strength, character, and value of this weaving. By reframing the question, we've clarified the nature of the work to be done. Occupying this subjective position, the aim of fearless Mormon thinking must be to investigate with great care and precision the nature of this weaving. Rather than being fundamentally in the business of fending off enemies of its otherworldly claims about angels and mummies and miracles, Mormon thinking, steered by its love for this vital enemy, will turn back to the more basic business of investigating the primal ground that head and world share. This primal site where head and world bleed into each other is ground zero for the manifestation of both life and grace. This primal site is the place where religion is lived rather than talked about. To this end, Mormon thinking is called to patiently and fearlessly, 1. Investigate what our religious claims look like when, shorn for the moment of their transcendence, they occupy just this robustly immediate, available, and often empirical ground, and 2. Investigate what happens to this shared ground when it is itself transfigured by that occupation. Brought so low to the ordinary ground of everyday things, what does Mormonism look like? Can Mormonism breathe the air down there? Can it live? Some things will doubtless look different from this low angle, but I'm confident that Mormonism can breathe the air just fine. You don't need a space suit if you're not in outer space. In fact, it seems to me that a fearless investigation of this subjective position, driven as it is by a love for its enemy, may simply coax into the open something that should have already been obvious to those whose hearts and minds are woven into the world by way of Mormonism. The truth that religion is not, fundamentally, about supernatural stuff. This is not to say that supernatural things aren't real, or that your neighbor down the street may not be entertaining angels, but I think it's fair to say that even if granted, such things are pretty rare and peripheral. I think it's fair to say that they are clearly not what a Sunday service is aiming at. Church isn't magic, and prayers aren't incantations. You can sit in church for 3 hours each Sunday for decades and never see anything supernatural. You can read and pray every day for a lifetime and never see anything supernatural. You can birth and bless and bury whole generations and never see anything supernatural. Does this mean religion is a sham? That it's broken? That it doesn't work? Or does it mean that something else, in plain sight, is going on instead? God seems to pretty intentionally keep supernatural stuff, including his own supernatural self, off the table for most people most of the time. Why be so coy if supernatural stuff is the point? Why spirit all the direct evidence away? Why so many complications and detours? Why have sermon after apostolic sermon about loving your ordinary neighbor, if such ordinary things were a diversion from the real supernatural deal? In itself, I don't take credulity to be a spiritual virtue, and I take God's palpable reticence on supernatural things to be more a blessing than a curse. His reticence is a gift that saves us from distraction. It brings us back, as God seems to intend, to the earth and the sun and the trees at hand. It keeps our eyes clear and our priorities straight. It keeps life's grip tight. For my part, I suspect that it may be only from this heretical perspective, from the enemy's perspective, occupied and loved, that the real richness and power and beauty of an ordinary Mormon life can come into sharp focus. I suspect that we may only be able to see what Jesus wants to show us if we manage to love our enemies as Jesus asked. And more, I suspect that if, in the end, Mormonism can justify its way of weaving together hearts and heads and worlds, it will only be able to do so by digging deep into the already available ground of ordinary Mormon life. Magic rocks and golden plates and stars beyond Kolob, even granted the full force of their objective reality, are far too small and weak to bear the burden of proof that only life itself, in the fullness of its banality and beauty, could ever hope to meet. Helping us to fearlessly acknowledge this may be the enemy's most enduring gift.
That was Adam Miller reading A Manifesto for the Future of Mormon Thinking from his book Future Mormon, available now in paperback and ebook from Greg Kofford Books. Thank you for listening to the Kofford Books AuthorCast. You can subscribe to our show on iTunes, Google Play, and other podcast feeds, and like us on Facebook for the latest news and information about our authors, releases, and promotions.